Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today, we're finally going to be talking about the newest album from Lana Del Rey called Norman fucking Rockwell. So let me give you a little bit of insider information when it comes to how albums are usually released in the modern era. Presumably, the album is done, or nearly done, singles released, maybe tries to spur a little bit of traction, and if it sticks, the countdown opens up to push the album to the public. Now, the window has shortened considerably in comparison with the predictable radio run, which means that if you start seeing an artist pushing more than a few singles before the album drops, or if you see the release date change when the single doesn't catch fire, not a good sign, especially behind the scenes for the artist and any label support that they might actually have. And I bring all this up because of all the acts for which I expected this would not be an issue, Lana Del Rey was on that list. Yeah, my issues with her have been very well documented. See the reviews of Ultraviolence, Honeymoon, and Lust for Life for the lengthy and contentious details on that. But she routinely sells a ton of albums, never quite matching her debut, but still really consistent. And with this album, right from the first single she was releasing, she was getting the sort of widespread critical acclaim that she hasn't seen properly in years, even from outlets who normally never gave her the time of day. And yet she started releasing her first singles nearly a year ago, and the album had been already delayed until the end of the summer. Hell, up until last week, I wasn't even sure this was gonna come out, let alone that it would drop and receive the most critical acclaim that she's ever gotten in her entire career. And given that I had purposely avoided any single that she had released, the most that I really knew going in was how her primary collaborator on production was Jack Antonoff. An intriguing choice, if only because whenever he toys with backwards-looking Americana, he can hit a decent stride. So I was fascinated how that would play in the writing and production. But alright, we probably should have gotten to this album a year ago, but what did Lana Del Rey deliver with Norman fucking Rockwell? You know, I feel like there's both more and less to say about this album than what has actually been said. And man, I really wish I could have avoided all the discourse around it the past couple of days so I could have had a cleaner listening experience. Instead, we've got an outlet embracing ridiculous hyperbole for all the clicks, calling her one of America's greatest living songwriters, followed by Lana Del Rey herself clapping back at a pretty thoughtful and descriptive NPR piece, claiming that she's never had a persona behind her and that she doesn't relate at all to all the iconography and observations made about her music. Which, you know what, would have been a truly fascinating statement until you stop to give it a second thought and realize the mountain of deflection and cognitive dissonance that's built into it. A whirl of misplaced hype and gleaming but slipshod iconography that Lana Del Rey absolutely benefits from, and make no mistake, she knows that. But if she wants to strip away the overwrought layers, break the separation of art and artist that most critics have centered in order to explain away their love for the melodramatic contradictions about Lana Del Rey and her music, you know what? I'll cut to those foundations, no matter how hopelessly cracked they might be. So while I'm still gonna say way too much about this project, strap in, this is a long review, let's not mince words. Norman fucking Rockwell is a good album, featuring real growth by Lana Del Rey as a songwriter. Growth that seems compromised everywhere else, from her vocal delivery to her compositions to any sense of thematic coherence on a listless slice of critic bait. I'm not remotely surprised that people find themselves compelled to write think pieces about Lana Del Rey and her art. Hell, I can appreciate the irony here, but at least for me, even some of that compulsion faded during the honeymoon phase 4 years ago. And really, I'm just going to be repeating a lot of stuff I've said before. But you know what? Before I get in deeper here, I want to clarify that critic bait is absolutely a loaded term, but I'm intending it with a very specific context, and one that I found kind of exasperating from Lana Del Rey damn near her entire career. The elevation of underweight, middlebrow melodrama content with bombastic swells in the execution, with the most self-awareness coming through an undercurrent of nihilism or irony. Hell, throw in the scattered classic rock iconography, smear it with postmodern word and mood association, and then say, America! And tons of critics will eat this shit up, especially from Gen X. And make no mistake, Lana Del Rey is far from alone in this territory. From the majority of LCD Sound System's career, to Kendrick Lamar making a song with U2, to significant chunks of Taylor Swift's 1989. From the 1975's Love It If We Made It, to Lana Del Rey's spiritual peer and occasional collaborator, Father John Misty, and especially pure comedy, this is a tried and true formula. And yet it's one that increasingly rings hollow for me and nearly always has felt empty coming from Lana Del Rey. Maybe because of how transparent it can feel. I certainly understand the appeal to blatant classic rock references and the obvious literary touch points and the attempts to call upon broad American dream iconography, all pressed through a gauzy, glamorous sheen, but it never seems to match the more intimate scale of the character portraits that at long last feel the most fleshed out that they have ever been. But also keep in mind that Lana Del Rey herself has emphasized that these are her stories, and she's chosen to paint these pictures as large as she has, crank up the dramatic weight in her own solitary experience. She has felt these emotions, she's framing it in this way for her, and that might not be a bad way to contextualize the album, if I'm gonna be frank. Hell, if you strip out how heavy-handed the vintage reference points are in trying to give these songs the misplaced weight, there is emotional complexity in this writing. For one, it seems like she's finally willing to put the asterisk next to the allure of all these toxic relationships that have been her stomping ground for years now, less enamored with all the machismo, and more willing to highlight the fractured, broken men who will project upon her to deflect from really examining themselves. And since she spent the past 4 albums cutting to a clear idea of who she is, in both her vices and virtues, the character portraits are a lot more stark, to the point where you start wondering if she's indeed talking about real people. Take the title track, which along with Mariner's Apartment Complex and Venice Bitch and their liberal Father John Misty references, can't help but make me wonder if we now know who met him in the hotel in 2017 and touched off the events that led to God's favorite customer. But none of it is a flattering picture of the self-loathing man-child artist spewing up bad poetry inspired by the news and sees her as fucked up as he is, when in reality, she might actually be okay for once and can be stronger for him, except for, continuing to be with him. But you know what? That's a nexus of creative ego centered around Los Angeles that this album will just spin and spin around, where Lana Del Rey will reference her addictive past on Fuck It, I Love You, and how she might still be kind of a mess on Love Story, before seeing her partner spiral into deflective drug addiction on Cinnamon Girl, where it's very clear there's more being left unsaid there and on California than what actually makes the record, if only to preserve his ego she's not saying more. And you can tell there's a reliance on that yearning as the album circles further and further, longer and longer, repeating the same give and take of a lot of the same metaphors, with what she misses most, the sense of idle stasis as the world will decay around her. We'll come back to that. And yet by the end of the album, she still sees hope, which on the surface, for as sprawling and tenuous as any thematic through line for this album is, I actually kind of agree with it. She's got no reason to believe that in her relationship or its overdrawn extrapolation to the world at large that it will get better, especially for someone who has chosen to live among her monsters rather than slay them. But in a change from lust for life, she sees a glimmer at the end of the tunnel. It's a better ending, it fits the melodrama, I'm kind of on board with it. But here's the problem. Dig even a little bit into the roots of that hope and her choice of iconography, and you'll realize that many of the old vices and pretensions, they're not gone away. She misses the balmy air of doing nothing precisely because she's had the privilege to luxuriate in it, or walk away to sleep with all the common people, enjoying the same idle detachment that is afforded those who can live within the lie of the American dream, or just slip out to buy a car in the middle of the night. It's the big reason why I've never really been able to buy into her satirical intent. Texturally, it just feels off in her writing and presentation, and there's no real element of serious risk that gives it any teeth to me. Thank God she's moved beyond the scrappy pretensions to noir that came from Ultraviolence and Honeymoon, but even in the face of real-world environmental damage, news that has shaken her partner badly, her hope is tinged with gallows humor. It's why the outro of The Greatest and then following it with Bartender lands with no impact for me. She references cultural burnout and Kanye West fading away and signs of the apocalypse, and how she's not like the women of the valley who will wear black at the parties and wear white to meditate in the garden. Later following it on the closing track, how she's not like the debutantes that put on the pretty dresses and the pretty smiles, given her own messy history with alcohol and her fractured parental relationship, how that she finds a way to fight and cope with all those old demons on her back. But it's hard to imagine her that far removed from those parties or debutantes when she's found the most pleasure in them, or if on Life on Mars is no longer just a song, she wouldn't have a space on the shuttle over if she actually wanted it. Because really, the only serious transgressive element that comes through is the conflation of her lightly toxic, spiraling relationship with Titanic American iconography. Which, as a show of ego, it is transgressive, don't get me wrong, but it's also the same through line she's been working since Born to Die. And given that she never leaves that bad boy who can't really hurt her, given that she's already hurt, which kind of puts the question mark back over Mariner's apartment complex, but there's lies all over this album. But all we get is the same shrinking, insulated, backwards-looking, conservative line that she's always given. And even if you expand the metaphor, highlight the parallel between the American dream and all those emotionally damaged, flailing, broken boys, it's not like she's leaving that either. Funny how we never get the subtext or deep dive into that revelation, eh? But you know what, that's never been the point of Lana Del Rey's music, especially on this album, where she's leaning into the meandering, grooveless soft rock that characterized a listless subset of the 60s and 70s pop and folk that really does not earn any label of psychedelia. Yeah, Venice Bitch meanders for nearly 10 minutes with the muddy sputter of guitar and the synth resting on a cushion of fluttering strings, but if you're gonna call back to that era of psychedelic rock, you would normally see a song this long end with some impassioned shredding or a go out in a blaze of glory, and we sure as hell are not getting that. But again, what's challenged a lot of discerning music critics who still like her stuff is how she can make those questionable lyrical themes and the framing of all of it still seem seductive and inviting through all the moody elegance. You don't want to like it, but you kinda do, which is one reason why I wish she'd just go all out into the bombastic melodrama, which also doesn't completely happen here. This is where I had the hope that Jack Antonoff would provide a little more momentum and flair to this production, and yet since he was unwilling to compromise all of her atmosphere, he took more of a back seat, leaving Lana Del Rey firmly in her comfort zone for the predictably scattered results. Now don't get me wrong, there are some striking or even beautiful moments here. The strings breaking into the subtle exasperation of the piano ballad that is the title track, the similar to how they flesh out the cleaner acoustics of Mariner's apartment complex, the aching melancholy of the lower strings on Love Song, the tenuous balance between the tenderness and some of the heavier smolder that she's ever had on California, which is easily my favorite song and the album highlight, and even how The Greatest tries to be the big, meaningful 70s power ballad, and if it wasn't for how the melody weirdly feels reminiscent of ABBA's The Winner Takes It All and Sam Smith's I'm Not the Only One, hell, it could have worked for me. But on the flip side, I'm not gonna ignore the questionable production choices, like how the vocal and percussion fidelity is never consistent even within the song, or how Lana Del Rey still remains a pretty limited singer, especially whenever she steps into her higher or falsetto range. She just does not have the breath control, or how this album has no concept of consistent momentum, especially at the end, and most of all when it hits a brick wall on Fuck It, I Love You, that epitomizes most of these problems coming right after Venice Bitch. And when you follow it with Doing Time, a pretty rote Sublime cover that strips out all the grit and scratching, and keep in mind I have never liked Sublime in any capacity, it's a real significant hurdle to get through to many of the better songs on the album. And yet paradoxically, a song like the roiling, fractured elegance of Cinnamon Girl, it actually flips many of those flaws into pieces that kinda come together and work for me, even if the synth spurts do get kinda distracting, or how the Next Best American Record tries to imitate the groove with the shattered humidity that can't quite match California right ahead of it, and you start questioning how many of these songs might just be kind of redundant. But to shorten all of this, too late, I want to circle back to Lana Del Rey's statement that this is her. None of this is a persona, and it never has been. And you know what, for Norman fucking Rockwell at least, I believe her. And I'm not looking for any moralistic excuse to condemn her. Frankly, I've grown past that. It was an issue back in my Ultraviolence review. I don't care anymore. And her writing has grown up as well. But that also doesn't mean that this album isn't performative, especially given the intimate songs of these stories channeled through the amplification of the iconography she uses and the music that she embraces. And the real dissonance comes in how much you believe the execution of these stories, how it matches the content, especially through the overheated melodrama that's always rang as her strongest lane. And thus, with Norman fucking Rockwell, for me, just kind of hit and miss. And for as much as it is framed as being revelatory both for her and her world, her larger picture of the American dream, she can't truly compromise her love for that veneer. And I'm just left thinking that on a song like Settle for Being Used, Carly Driftwood captured that raw, vulnerable picture of complicated femininity just as well, if not better, as did Lydia Loveless on Real, and Laurie McKenna on Halfway Home, or Dessa on pretty much all of Chime, or Nico Case on Hell On, or Emily Scott Robinson on Traveling Mercies. And when I have to make those comparisons and place this album in the larger context, it's a light 6 out of 10, recommended most for the fans or the curious who just want to see all the hype. And while I probably said way too much here, even if it was her point to leave the question in the air, why am I left feeling that Lana Del Rey just didn't quite say enough? That's just saying. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. Like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Folks, keep in mind that if you go back to my previous reviews, this is actually the highest I've ever rated a Lana Del Rey album. I see the appeal of this, for sure. For me, it's a thematic dissonance that doesn't work between the intentions and the actual text of the content and how it's presented. Probably could have said that faster, but there's a lot of fine details here. But if you want to buy or stream it, links down in the description below, and I got the poll up there for all the Lana fans to, again, tell me how wrong I am. Looking forward to it. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And hey, if you're looking for other reviews or for the newest episode of Billboard Breakdown, it is on the second channel, and the link's in the card right over here. But till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.